Well, so we are whizzing back down south now and to the city of Norwich. And of course, this is a slight taster or preview of some of the fantastic buildings we'll be looking at in the spring. And we're also moving back up the social scale as well, because today I'm going to be talking about some of my research on Norwich houses, but particularly today focusing on the value of testamentary evidence and probate inventories relating to the civic elite. So those merchant families who served as alderman and mayor of the city. And I'm particularly thinking about the relationship between the architectural spaces and the furnishings and objects within them, and what we can learn from this about the use of space, but also about the constitution of public and private in the early modern city. The domestic context was crucial for the creation not just of social status, but elite social networks and also political authority. And so I want to think about how objects are being used alongside the buildings in that way. So I'll start with quite a well-known example, Strangers' Hall in Norwich, one of the best preserved of these large merchant houses. Originates in the medieval period with this 14th century undercroft with the Great Hall raised above. And you can see here the development of the plan over many centuries, but essentially we have an open hall at the heart with a series of wings around it containing pairs of parlours and chambers over them. The hall at Strangers' Hall is a particularly fine example, built initially in the 15th century and then rebuilt and re-edified in the early 16th century when the house was owned by Nicholas Southerton, who was a grocer who became mayor of the city in 1539, and at that date rebuilt his Great Hall and added in the crown post roof, which is decorated with his merchant's mark and the cross of St. George. The Guild of St. George was the premier civic guild for the merchants of the city. He inserts this bay window, which has been brought from another property. And so this is a fine example of a particularly grand urban hall. And we know from other studies, in particular the work of Jane Grenville and Sarah Pearson, that large open halls are actually quite rare in urban contexts. And at this social level, they are really making links between the merchant elite and the local gentry elite. So having the appearance of a formal grand public hall was a significant mark of status. But what's interesting in the Norwich houses is that the appearance of the traditional tripartite hall with its service end and paired service doorways actually often hides a more complex relationship to the service spaces. In particular, lots of these halls have direct access to undercrofts and storage spaces, which was such an important part of a mercantile household. So there's a sense here that on some occasions, the hall could be used for business. And we have several references in inventories to counters. Counting tables where you could draw up accounts being located in halls. But on other occasions, the hall could be a setting for grand civic feasts and is decorated with the insignia of the merchant companies and the city corporation. And these types of spaces are known from other cities, and in particular Roger Leach in Bristol has shown how these grand medieval halls were often retained through the early modern period as symbols of the antiquity and honour of the family, and they weren't really very much in use for daily life by the time we get to the even the 15th and 16th centuries, and that's definitely the case here in Norwich as well. None of the large medieval halls we have in Norwich have any evidence for a fireplace, for instance. And this retention of the medieval space at the heart of the house is something we see again and again in Norwich. So the Southerton family continued to reside here through the 16th century. Several generations of the sons of the family become sheriffs or mayors of the city. And the Southertons are busy updating their parlours and chambers. They're installing new fireplaces, wooden panelling, but they keep the medieval hall unaltered at the heart of the property. It's not until the early 17th century that this staircase and gallery is put in by a later owner. And the testaments, the last wills of several members of the Southerton family also give us an indication of some of the furnishings that we might expect to see in some of these rooms. So widow Mary Southerton, who died in 1592, left to her son John all of the ceilings and hangings in the house. She also mentions a great Danish counter with leaves, 2 graven forms and a French cupboard in the hall. And in the Great Parlor, there was a large drawing table, a joined form and a French cupboard, and another French cupboard and a long drawing table with leaves in the Little Parlour. And so this distinction between the Great and Little Parlour as rooms for dining, because we have these long drawing tables, is something that we see in other contexts. A neighbouring house, Suckling House, has a very similar form to Strangers' Hall. There's a large 14th century hall in the middle of the complex, open to the roof, with, you can just see blocked at the low end of the cross passage, a pair of service doorways, but again in this case actually giving on to a vaulted undercroft space which was used for trade rather than service rooms. There's a bay window that was inserted in the 15th century, and originally there was a whole courtyard of timber buildings in front of this hall, which were demolished in the 1890s when the tram was put through that section of the city. The reason that Suckling House is so important is that it has associated with it the only surviving probate inventory of the wealthy merchant class of early modern Norwich. Many of you will be familiar with the important study of Norwich inventories done by Ursula Priestley and Penelope Caulfield. It was published in Post-Medieval Archaeology in 1982. That's a really significant quantitative study of the probate inventory evidence from 16th, 17th and early 18th century Norwich. And from that, they're able to draw out some really important trends in the disposition of different spaces. We see the shift from halls to kitchens. We see the development of upper floor spaces and attic spaces, many of which were being used in the textile industry in Norwich. And that's an important quantitative study. And many of those trends we can see mapped onto the wider vernacular architecture that survives in the city. And the bulk of those inventories, of course, relate to the middling sort, broadly, craftsmen, shopkeepers and traders. I do think it would be worth going back to those inventories and doing a more qualitative analysis and really trying to get inside the houses and look at the activities that are going on there. But for this social level, we have just a single surviving inventory, and that is the inventory of Robert Suckling, who was mayor of the city, who died in 1589. And I'm not going to go through the whole inventory because that would take a long time. I'm going to give you a flavour of the furnishing of some of the key spaces. So in the hall, we have a framed table carved with lions, framed forms and a wainscot chair, some cushions, a counter again, and the Civic mace is being held there. Excuse me. So the hall is sparsely furnished, but with impressive carved furniture. Its medieval architecture could still provide a prestigious setting for the formal reception of guests, and was an appropriate locale for the display of the civic regalia and other inventories in the city and in other cities mention the presence of stands where these maces could be displayed. But the most lavish furnishings are in the Great Parlor, where we have drawing tables, forms, cupboards, embroidered chairs, 4 women's stools, cushions, window curtains. There's a turkey work carpet, which being valued at £9 is the single most expensive item in his inventory. There are hanging pictures and wall hangings. So the Great Parlor is a room of state, furnished specifically for formal dining, with side tables for serving and a livery cupboard for the display of silver plate. We've got chairs designed to accommodate women's formal costume and expensive and imported soft furnishings. And the architectural setting of the room is also significant because although it doesn't survive today, we know recorded in antiquarian sources that the windows contained stained glass panels with the coats of arms of the Sucklings and of previous generations and owners of the property. But the daily life of the household was taking place in the little parlour, which is also furnished for dining with a table and 12 joined stools. It is a more intimate room, which is probably the everyday dining room. And this is also indicated because in the buttery next to the little parlour is where all of the family's pewter is being stored. It may have been particularly a centre of daily activities for the women of the household, given the presence of a pair of virginals and the presence of textiles and furnishings here, some of which are described as old, may testify to women's role in the preservation of household goods as much as a lack of external display. In the buttery next to the little parlour, as I've said, is a very large quantity of pewter vessels. There's also an incredibly well-stocked kitchen, which has a variety of cooking implements, including brass and copper pots and pans. We have spits turned by a mechanical jack, dripping pans, mortars and chafing dishes, all testimony to the scale and sophistication of the household's entertaining. This is a partial inventory because some categories of goods, including Suckling's clothing and his silver plate, are not listed. So after those categories, the most expensive group of items is the household linen, which is listed separately at the end of the inventory. And he had over £35 worth of tablecloths and napkins, carefully distinguished between damask, diaper patterned and plain, cloths for long tables, side tables, and cupboards. The inventory also tells us about the interpenetration of commercial and domestic space. There's a warehouse with a great weighing beam, and then there is a counting house parlour, which contains a whole series of cupboards and boxes for documents, stools and tables, a pair of gold weights and a pile of brass weights and a pair of scales, and a map on the wall and a table of Suckling's coat of arms. Then there are 8 different bedchambers, all listed and distinguished by the varied nature of their internal decoration, the quantity and the quality of the furnishings. The great chamber had a posted bedstead with curtains and a valance and a tapestry covering. valued at £4, making it the second most expensive item in the house. There was a green embroidered chair, 2 cypress chests, and 8 small maps. So we have here decorative furnishings which may indicate that the Great Chamber was used on occasion for the reception of people and guests, but other chambers had a range of beds of lesser value and chests and wainscot chairs. The maid's chamber and the kitchen chamber had old bedsteads and some old chairs. So at Strangers' Hall and Suckling House, we see a continuation of a late medieval form of organising domestic space. There's a great hall, which is a formal but rather empty and echoing reception room. We have dining parlours, and there are chambers, but not much indication that the bedchambers are being used for reception and display, except in some limited sense. And the form of the house also speaks to this. The arrangement of units of parlours and chambers around the Great Hall seems to be a continuation of that late medieval pattern, which has been suggested to represent possibly a means of accommodating different family members in different circumstances within the household in what's been called the unit system. In particular, that arrangement of space would allow, for instance, an urban widow to be accommodated comfortably with a parlour and a chamber as part of but separate from the main household. But these older medieval forms of building stand in contrast to other merchant houses that are being constructed in the mid-16th century, where we see changes in the form and disposition of space. We see a move towards the elaboration of upper floor chambers. So here at Augustine Steward's house, there was an older medieval hall at the back of the property, but Augustine Steward, who was one of the wealthiest merchants in medieval, in early modern Norwich, built this grand new street frontage with this 8-bay great chamber along the front with its deeply roll moulded timber ceiling. So here we have the reception rooms moving to the first floor and moving to the frontage of the house. We see a similar trend here at Henry Bacon's house, where the Great Hall is sealed over and a suite of 4 upper chambers with these deeply carved and moulded ceilings are created, connected by a staircase in a turret with plasterwork. And at Edmund Wood's house on Firebridge Street, again, we see the creation of a parlour and chamber block with elaborately moulded timber decorated ceilings. Edmund Wood's will gives a hint of the colour, vibrancy and luxuriousness of the furnishings of these very wealthy merchant citizens. He refers to the best posted bedstead in my great chamber with a covering, my 2 best chairs, one of crimson satin and the other of purple velvet wrought with bucks, with a stool of the same work, an embroidered chair of red stamen, a carpet, and a cupboard cloth of needlework and a yellow window cushion embroidered. So how did material culture enable people to negotiate the changing forms and uses of these spaces in the 16th century? Rooms weren't simply neutral containers in which a newly expanded realm of movable goods was mobilized in the service of rank. I would suggest rather that the forms of architectural spaces impacted on the experience of material possessions, and these worked in tandem. So in the context of this general rebuilding of the 16th century, the retention of the medieval hall was a conscious strategy to emphasize the honor and antiquity of the family. And the mace of high office and the coats of arms relate to the political standing of the head of the household, and they are given weight and substance from their display in a medieval architectural setting, even though this was often purchased by the family rather than inherited. But in other spaces, the imported carpets, furniture and maps speak to the house as a mercantile space, intimately connected to the expanding world of commerce. And the tableware and dining furniture allowed the household to participate in the redefinition of material display and sociability. So we know that the merchants of Norwich are leaving in their wills a huge quantity of objects related to dining and hospitality. A silver plate, of course, is one of the most common items in which you can pass on wealth to your successors. But the form of these objects, in particular the description of large standing salts and covered cups, speak to that importance of impressive display in the context of dining and hospitality. The second most common items bequeathed by Norwich merchants were their civic robes of office going down to the eldest son. So that's a powerful evocation of a strategy of family status and identity. But the changing architectural settings of these prestigious artifacts also had an impact on their use and meaning. So just to take one example, from the later 16th century onwards, we see the development of new ceramic vessel forms in different materials. Excavations from across Norwich reveal the increasing importation of tin glazed earthenware from the Low Countries. And in fact, Norwich had the first English production site for this type of pottery from the 1570s, run by a pair of Dutch immigrants. So there's a new emphasis on decorative flatwares, and many of these surviving examples are decorated with religious iconography, allegorical devices such as the five senses or the five virtues, or they commemorate significant national events. And of course, such decoration is also found on silver vessels. Rather than creating an impressive, substantial display of plate, which might be found on a cupboard, these artifacts gain their effective power from their distinctive colours and textures, as well as their complex imagery. So they may have been used within different modes of dining and sociability. They suggest smaller gatherings of elite groups, perhaps in the dessert or banquet course after the main meal, where the narratives and allegories could be shared and discussed, accompanied by sweetmeats, fruit, and wine. So we could argue that these were mobilized in more intimate spaces, such as dining parlors, rather than a great open hall, and in rooms where light was provided by large glazed windows or many candles. In this way, we can see architectural spaces and material cultures conversing and converging, reconfiguring elite social practices and identities in new and complex ways. And this shifting expression of status and sociability for 16th century urban elites was, of course, part of a wider transformation bound up with the impact of the Reformation, which brought significant challenges to the traditional social order and hierarchy on which their power rested. So, for instance, we see the transformation of public spaces. The medieval friary was turned into a common hall of the city. The medieval Guild of St. George was reconfigured as a secular feasting company. There's a real focus in Norwich on the creation of a strong corporate identity for the civic elite, and this is displayed in the public realm through the commissioning of a very impressive sequence of civic portraits of civic elders, many of them retrospective portraits of well-known civic leaders from the earlier 16th century. We have the bequests to the city corporation of large quantities of feasting plate. Augustine Stewart, in one of his most generous bequests, gave to the city this civic mace carved of rock crystal, which is still in use in the city today. So in this context of political and religious upheaval, the creation of a strong corporate identity was a response to those challenges, and the house took on a new role in this politically charged atmosphere as urban families pursued distinctive strategies, which were based either on the retention or the rebuilding of their residential spaces, and new domestic practices, especially those associated with the display of material wealth, entertainment, and hospitality. New discourses which emphasized the distinctive qualities of gentility at the expense of older traditions of communal bonds and largesse, symbolized by the Great Hall, this was articulating the changing material context of domestic life, but was central to the ongoing negotiation of social and political identities. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks.